All right, so we're picking up with part three of the review, and last time when we left off, we were talking about Alexander Hamilton's economic policies. Now, one of the components of it is the controversy he had with Thomas Jefferson, and the fact that they have two very different views on what the Constitution entails. Hamilton is a loose constructionist, is what it's called, and it means he has a loose interpretation of the Constitution. In other words, if it's not in there, it's not saying you can't do it. Jefferson, on the other hand, is a strict constructionist, or he has a strict interpretation of it in the fact that if it's not in the Constitution, then if it's not explicitly stated in the Constitution, then you cannot do it. So we move forward in the story a little bit to when Washington decides to leave office. And when he does, one of his biggest legacies is his farewell address, in which he warns against a couple of things. Number one is against foreign entanglements. And he does this because he realizes we're not ready for it. All right, we're a baby country. We are not prepared or equipped to get involved in world affairs. So he warns the future leaders and the leaders that we have now to not get involved in foreign entanglements. Also, he warns against political parties because his main concern is that people will begin to put the party above the country. In other words, they're more worried about their agenda than what is good for the country. So we move forward to the presidency of Thomas Jefferson from 1801 to 1809. We're kind of skipping Adams for the purpose of this. You do need to know a couple of things about it. One is the XYZ affair, which we talked about in class, and the other one is the Alien and Sedition Acts. So be sure that even though they're not on here, you're aware of the components of it. So we move past Adams to Jefferson, and his election is referred to as the Revolution of 1800, and it's called the Revolution of 1800 because it's a switch in policy. All right, you're going from the first two presidents of the United States being Federalists to Jefferson, who is the epitome of an anti-Federalist or a states' rights advocate. And as you can see from the electoral map on here, Jefferson did not really have a lot of trouble winning this thing. We'll move forward from here and talk about some of his policies and the things that he did as president. All right, one of the main components of Jefferson's presidency is something that is referred to as Jeffersonian Democracy, and you should be able to compare this to Jacksonian Democracy as we go down the line. Some of the characteristics of it. Number one, it's all about the yeoman farmer, or rural people, the common man. It's kind of who it's applying to, who it's pushed towards. Also, states' rights, as I mentioned a while ago, and smaller government overall, but especially at the federal level. So the first big thing we're going to talk about with Jefferson is the Louisiana Purchase, and it's significant for a couple of reasons. Number one, as you can see from the map, it basically doubles the size of America at this time. So it's a huge amount of territory that we're going to be able to purchase. The background on it we went through in class, but we originally go to talk to France to buy the port of New Orleans, and I think it's $10 million we said that they were authorized to spend. Well, while we're there, it just so happens that Napoleon, who's in charge in France at this time, decides that he's sick of the New World because of the Haitian Revolution and because he has other things going on at home. So he can't really devote a lot of time, energy, or money to the New World. So he just wants to get rid of whatever he's got, and that's the Louisiana Territory. So we go in trying to buy New Orleans, and they offer us the entire Louisiana Territory, and we're like, whoa, we need to kind of think about this for a second. Well, Jefferson gets the proposal, and he's more or less conflicted on it because of his way of interpreting the Constitution and the fact that he's a strict constructionist. There's nothing in there that gives him the authority to buy this land, and he suffers over it. He thinks about it for a long time, knowing that in his heart, in his interpretation, he can't do this. But at the end of the day, what it comes down to is the overall good of the country outweighs his feelings about the Constitution. So he gets past his personal beliefs on that and purchases the land and doubles the size of the country. All right, so we move forward from Louisiana Purchase to the Marshall Court, which is named after Chief Justice John Marshall of the Supreme Court at this time. Some of the main things you need to know about him. Number one is he had a very strong belief in a strong central government. He was a very hardcore Federalist, and his decisions on the cases that came before him reflected that. And the three main cases you need to know are Marbury versus Madison, Dartmouth College versus Woodward, and McCulloch versus Maryland. Marbury versus Madison, as far as the significance of it, it establishes something called judicial review, in which the Supreme Court has the authority, according to Marshall, to declare acts of Congress unconstitutional. So what he's doing here is he's giving a lot more power to the judicial branch of the government over the legislative branch. Let's see, Dartmouth College versus Woodward talks about states and how they cannot encroach on a federal contract, and then McCulloch versus Maryland deals with the fact that states cannot tax a federal entity, and in this case, the federal entity we're talking about is the National Bank. Rolling on to the War of 1812, the second conflict we'll talk about in this review. You just basically, like I said, no major battles, don't need to know any of that, just the causes and the consequences of the war. And the causes are pretty simple. Britain is being a pain in our tail. All right, they're doing what's called impressing our soldiers, which doesn't mean to, try to look good in front of them. It means to kidnap them and make them serve in the British Navy. And we talked about in class how they went about that. Also, they're interfering with our commerce and as far as their ships of their navy, annoying or harassing or sometimes taking over our merchant ships, and then they're starting to start stuff on the frontier with Native Americans to get them all riled up, so we have to deal with the problems with them. As far as the consequences of it, the federal party goes bye-bye after this. It's the demise of it. Because of the policies and the stance that they took on the war. Also, a lot of nationalism comes into play, which is just pride in your country and the fact that we have beaten Britain twice in less than, 100 years. Well, actually about less than 50 years. Also, we begin to promote industrialization. In other words, we're able to take care of ourselves in a way that we haven't been able to do before. And lastly, Andrew Jackson, who we'll talk about here in a second, becomes a national figure in the fact that he's a hero of the war at the Battle of New Orleans, which actually, as we talked about in class, occurred after the war was over. But because of the way communication worked back then, he did not get the word. Now we move from Jefferson to James Monroe and some of the components about it. We'll talk about the Monroe Doctrine here in a second. But Clay's American System is one of the defining events of this presidency. And all this does, and it's devised by Henry Clay, is to give internal improvements in infrastructure to America. He wants to link the East, the South, and the West through canals, through turnpikes, and through other various methods. And he wants to do it using federal authority and using federal dollars. And that's where the conflict comes in, because you have a lot of people who are states' rights advocates and believe that the federal government does not have the authority to come in and put these roads down or build these canals or whatever it is. He also has tariffs as a means to pay for all of this, and that kind of brings up some conflict as well, as tariffs normally do, as we'll see. All right, so next we've got the Missouri Compromise of 1820, which is the first major conflict over slavery in the United States, and we have many more to come as we go. Here's what it boils down to. Missouri wants to come into the Union as a state, and they want to come in as a slave state, but that's going to be a problem because at this time in the Senate or in Congress, we have 6 slave states and 6 non-slave, and it basically keeps what's called the sectional balance intact. And if you add a slave state or you add a non-slave state, it's going to let that whatever side gets the additional state, it's going to give them a lot more power and allow them to pursue their agendas to a greater degree. So we've got to come up with some way to sort this out to let them into the Union, and the Missouri Compromise is what does this. And basically what it says is, okay, Missouri can come in as a slave state, that's cool, but we got to let in a non-slave state as well, and the one that they decide on is Maine. Also, they draw a line at what is known as the 3630 line, latitude and longitude, right through here, as you can see highlighted on the screen, in which they say if any new states come online above this line, they are not allowed to have slavery. The last event of this chapter is the Monroe Doctrine, which basically said, look, here's the deal. We've got enough to worry about over here. So Europe, I need you to stay out. All right, don't come over here and try to form any more colonies or do anything like that. In other words, stay out of our hemisphere. And in return, what we're going to do is we're going to stay out of European affairs. So it's basically, if you want to look at it this way, stay on your own side of the fence and don't, cross over and interfere with anything that they have going on, as long as they don't interfere with anything we've got going on. All right, we have made it to Chapter 6, the Age of Jackson, which concerns itself with a majority of the years, of the presidency of Andrew Jackson, plus a little bit more from 1824 to 1840. All right, so here we go with the presidency of Andrew Jackson, and the features of it are referred to as Jacksonian Democracy, or I guess I should say the philosophy of it. And there's a lot of similarities between it and Jeffersonian Democracy. Number one, you have a belief in the common man. Number 2 is expanding suffrage. Remember, suffrage means right to vote, so it's extending it to more people. Next is patronage, or as it's referred to during the presidency of Jackson, the spoils system, and we talked about that in class. And then also just a general opposition to elites, helping out the common man, having a chip on your shoulder against people higher on the economic ladder than you and the attitudes that they possess. Now we roll on to the events of Andrew Jackson's presidency, and the first and one of the most important is the Tariff of Abominations, or the Tariff of 1828. The primary purpose of this tariff, which is the purpose of a majority of tariffs that we talk about, is protection for American industry. We talked about in class how You put this thing on, that way products coming in from abroad are going to have a little bit of a price added to them. In other words, you're trying to give an advantage to the people at home. Basically what it boils down to, the South feels like it works against them, and they don't like it because a lot of their products go to England, and if England is not shipping us as much, or if they start a trade war, it's going to hurt them economically. So they feel like the tariff of 1828 is more favorable to the North at the expense of the South. So what they try to do, and in particular in South Carolina, is they nullify it. In other words, they void it and say, we're not going to follow it. We're not going to adhere to this tariff. And the reasons for this are laid out by John C. Calhoun in the South Carolina Exposition and Protest, in which he outlines the fact that a state does have the ability to nullify federal law. Jackson responds with potentially military force, and eventually something called the Force Bill, which says the president has the authority to send the military to enact or to protect and to make sure a federal law is followed through upon. The opposition to it is best exemplified by the Webster-Hayne debate. We talked about that in class, so I'm not going to cover it here. Next is the bank war between Andrew Jackson and Nicholas Biddle, who was, I guess you could call it, the chairman of the National Bank during this time. Now, Jackson had a lot of problems with the National Bank, and he wanted to see it go away. So to that end, he decided not to re-up on the charter. In other words, not to approve the re-charter of the bank. As far as the consequences and things of it go, Jackson supports the removal of federal deposits from the Bank of the U.S. His attack on it caused an expansion of credit and speculation, which is not a good thing in an economy, especially like ours. State banks begin to increase and put out or issue paper currency. And it's a catalyst for the emergence of a two-party system. The Whigs, which is the party that comes out of this, completely hates Jackson and all his policies, and they begin to come onto the national stage because of the things that come about with the bank war. Another significant event of Jackson's presidency is Indian removal, and it all comes about because this is some pretty, if you look at this map, this is some pretty valuable land down in the southeast that is occupied by the Cherokee Nation during this time, and white settlers down here want the Indians gone so they can farm this land. Well, through the events that we don't have to worry about, the case of trying to get the Indians off the land ends up in the Supreme Court in the form of Worcester versus Georgia. And the opinion of this case, written by John Marshall, who we've already talked about, says that the Indians cannot be forcibly removed from their land. And Jackson's famous quote, I believe, is something like, he can come down here and enforce it if he wants to. I'm paraphrasing, but Jackson pretty much ignores it and institutes the policy of Indian removal, which is best exemplified by the Trail of Tears, which, once again, if you look at the map, is the path or the trail or the route that these Native Americans took on the way to Oklahoma, full of hardship, sickness, death, miserable experience for all of them, and really, you know, a completely sad thing. Alright, so we rode to planters and slaves in the antebellum South. I'm having a little trouble pronouncing stuff because it's late. But the first thing we've got to look at is, why was slavery, why did this explosion in slavery happen in the South during this time period? And the pure fact of it is that cotton is king in the South. Alright, and there's a couple factors that make this possible. Number one is the invention and popularization of the cotton gin, which just simply made it quicker and easier and cheaper to produce cotton. In other words, to separate what's called the boll from the seeds. And once this happens, slavery becomes profitable for slave owners again. Before this, there was a chance of it more or less dying out because people weren't making money using slave labor. But once this comes on board, it explodes once again. Also, you have a lot of new land coming online from the Louisiana Purchase that is usable, is available to put cotton on. So you have a lot of landowners expanding, and when you expand, you've got to have a larger labor force, and that labor force happens in the form of slaves. And also the rise of textiles, which is the end-all product of cotton. Cotton's the raw material, textiles are the end product. As this rises, as this explodes, there's a need for more cotton. So you combine that with the other factors that we're looking at, and it's you know, obvious why slavery becomes as huge as it was in the South. This will be the last thing we deal with in this part of it, and it's Southern society as a whole. It's very important to remember that a majority of whites in the South did not own slaves at this time. It's very easy to use this stereotypical Gone with Evelyn view that everyone in the South had a plantation and a huge house and tons of slaves and all that, but that just simply wasn't the fact. Majority of people were small farmers that didn't own any slaves, and not to excuse it, but a lot of people as well owned less than 5. So you need to be aware of that as a historical fact as we move forward. All right, that wraps up part three. We'll move on to part four, continue talking about slave society, and hopefully get on the road to the Civil War at some point.